It's Clark and Perry
on the case.
Da-na-na-na. Clark and Perry do what it takes. Da-na-na-na. Clark and Perry investigate.
The activities and interests of local artists in the Windy City's finest throughout both Lethbridge and Medicine Hat, Alberta. Available on TELUS Optic TV on demand, VidFlex, YouTube, and more for limited time only. Terms and conditions apply.
Da-na-na-na.
I'm Perry, he's Clark, and we are joined once again by Eli.
Hello.
Thank you so much for joining with us again.
No, once again, thank you.
And I'm super excited to dive into some poetry with you.
Mm-hmm.
So I understand that this is like a passion of yours. You find it super interesting. And I'm just wondering, like, if you could maybe speak to that a little bit. Like, does it inform your artwork, or is it kind of separate? Or
No, really good question. I think so. Poetry is something that I definitely came to a lot later in life than my drawing and my art. Whereas I was drawing since I was maybe like 6 years old or younger. I think it was only like a bit in high school, but really it wasn't until university proper, when I was in like my adult years. I was like at least in my like late teens, early 20s, when I really got into poetry. There sort of is a family connection for why I've always been intrigued by it. So my great grandfather on my dad's side of the family, a man named Isaac Weens, he, by all accounts, he was a poet, or at least he read a lot of poetry. He was deeply religious too, so I think his twin passions in life were reading and contemplating like scripture and the Bible, as well as reading poetry. And he was a farmer, but by all accounts, he was more interested in the life of the mind and of contemplating like words, than probably, like maintaining a farm.
Yeah. And where better to do that than on a farm? I know that you can be very, very busy on a farm, but like, I imagine open spaces, lots of nature. And, interesting.
Yeah. So, and I guess, so when my first maybe exposure to poetry when I was in high school was that my dad told me how one of the things that he did that was quite notable was he memorized the entirety of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, where it is like a 7-part epic poem on the nature of kind of like man's place in context to nature, like how to be an ethical person. It's about kind of like sin and retribution and stuff. And it's very long, probably from start to finish. If you're going to recite it, it probably will take about half an hour, like at like a conversational pace. Wow. And he had it down, nailed. And my parents always said, I mean, in school, I guess I kind of enjoyed memorizing things anyways, like song lyrics and stuff. So when I heard this story that my dad told me, like something, I was like, well, first I found the poem and read it, and honestly, it was very like dense and esoteric. And when I was like a teenager, like most of it was lost on me, but there was something incredibly compelling about it, where there was this deep, deep desire to like know it more, because obviously, like, I mean, I got the very distinct impression that like every word was precise and deliberate. Like there's kind of like a depth of meaning that was currently inaccessible to me, but it was like kind of like a challenge to get into it more. So I can't claim that I know it now in its entirety, because it's like, I guess for really big memorization projects, it takes, like practice. It's like use it or lose it kind of thing. But at various points in my life, I have been able to recite the entirety of the poem from front to back. I have
dinner party.
No. I wouldn't subject people to that. It's more, no. It's I don't know. It's maybe just for my own benefit. But I think so. That was maybe my first foray into poetry, and since then, I don't know. It's something I found just deeply enjoyable. In addition to doing art, or like when I was going out throughout school for my science stuff. So that's kind of how I got into poetry.
That's awesome. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And like one of the things that kind of stood out to me in that was that idea of every word is placed there for a reason.
Yes.
And I really love that. And it also made me think about your artwork. And I was like, they put their words there for a reason, but I think, you put each stroke or each brush stroke or each pencil line there for a reason. And even I think last time we were together, we kind of explored this method of like an automated kind of
automatic art.
Automatic art. And I believe that this is an example of
that.
And it's just like, you may not even know why you're putting the line there, but like, there's something that compels you, that draws you to put, pun not intended, but
Yeah.
that draws you to put the
Yeah,
line there, you know?
Yeah.
And I just found that
Mhm.
interesting. And then I guess like another question I would have.
Mhm.
So we're not going to look at that 7-part poem today,
No.
but we are going to look at I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud by William Wordsworth today. And so I was just wondering if you could speak to like William Wordsworth and this poem specifically, and what draws you to it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh no, sounds good. I'll try not to ramble on too much about it.
Oh no, please do.
Yeah. So I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, yeah, as you said, is a poem by the Romantic era poet William Wordsworth. Actually, he kind of comes from the same ilk or the same poetic lineage as Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who wrote Rime of the Ancient Mariner. He was, yeah, they were kind of belonging to the same, I guess, like artistic or poetic movement, which is like they're from the Romantic era of poetry.
And just really quick, Romantic era, just for folks and myself.
Certainly. Yeah.
Do you know what time period that is, roughly? Or?
Yes, roughly so. I'm sure, like, you know, I'm sure there's like an official time that like art people have agreed on, but at least this poem, and I think Rhyme was published around the same time. But anyways, this poem was first published in 1807. So this was about 200 years ago in England, where the Romantic era was happening. And I guess the themes of the Romantic era were, it was sort of like, there was a lot of, I guess, reverence for nature and kind of a lot of probably like just trying to capture like the splendor of nature and humankind's place within it. That's a recurrent theme. The artist escapes me, but the visual side of this movement, I think it's typified by the painting. Is it called A Wanderer Above a Sea of Clouds? It's an image you would have seen. It's even like a pixelated version is in Minecraft even, where it's kind of, so you see the back of like a explorer with like it's like a scabbard or like a walking stick on his hip, and he's on a hill, and then there's sort of this like valley shrouded in fog below him. And I think that image, it's very striking, and it kind of visually captures a lot of what the Romantics were trying to do, like sort of like the sheer splendor and like vastness of nature in contrast to like, I guess, like the singularity and the smallness of like people.
Interesting. Yeah. You know what? That's really interesting. I don't know if I have seen that, but you know what it made me think of? It honestly made me think of here in Lethbridge, some mornings when you're driving down Whoop Up Drive.
Oh my gosh, yes.
And the valley, sometimes you get that smoke kind of shrouding some of the trees and stuff. And then the bridge just kind of shoots up from, you know, and that's what it made me think of. And that's like present day, 200 years later.
Exactly.
And it's still alive. That's really interesting. Yeah.
See, I've never thought of like, but I mean, of course, I think if anybody's lived in Lethbridge, they've experienced that. No, exactly. Like we have our own sea of fog in the river bottom on occasion. Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. Awesome. So I think we should probably give this thing a read here.
For sure.
And we'll do it out loud to share it with everybody. I think maybe let's each take kind of split back and forth between the verses.
For sure.
So do you want the first and third or the second and fourth?
Let's see. I'll let you kick it off.
Okay, I'll kick it off, and then I'll also do the third stanza. And then we'll kind of talk about some of the themes and what comes to mind, and some other things about it.
Sounds good.
Awesome. I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud by William Wordsworth. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze.
Continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I with a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance.
The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not be but gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought.
For oft when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they pass upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils.
Awesome, cool. Thank you so much for reading that with me. So first things first, there was definitely a word in there that I had not come across before. Jocund.
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 Yeah, so okay. I remember, this is another thing I love about poetry, where often when you read it, there are certain words that it's kind of an archaic word, not one we'd hear often, but it's kind of like when you maybe tug on that string and look into it and know what the word means, it kind of then that is a possible inroad that opens up, the meaning of the poem a bit more. And in much the same way, I remember when I read this years ago, jocund also stuck out to me. So jocund is related to the word jocular, and jocular relates to, I guess if somebody can be described as jocular, they're kind of in very good spirits or very lively company.
Right.
Yeah, so in such a jocund company, in such a, he's describing the daffodil field as a very, a lively crowd of guests almost.
Interesting. Yeah. Cool. Great. And then I also noticed that each of these lines, so there's obviously, first things first, there's obviously a rhyming scheme going on here. And so it looks like it's an A, B, A, B, C, C. So then in practice, that would sound like cloud, hills, crowd, daffodils, and then trees and breeze. Awesome. And that goes all the way through, I believe.
Exactly.
That rhyming scheme. So that's kind of interesting. And then I also noticed that each line has a certain number of syllables. And the first place that I would have come across that would have been with Shakespeare. So Shakespeare's sonnets, well renowned for having basically 10 syllables to a line. But then sometimes you split that up and you break that up and maybe you'll have 10 or 11 or 12 or 9. And just going back to kind of that idea of every word is put there for a reason, I think it makes me think of every syllable, every sound is there for a reason as well.
Yes.
So do you have anything to add about any of that or not really?
I think so. Just on the note how you said, so in this case, you have A, B, C, C. And now for the first 5 of those lines in the stanza, it's 8 syllables per line. And then on the very last one, you add that extra breath or that extra syllable. You stretch it out to 9. A thing I love about poetry is just, I guess, the way you can utilize the poetic form to make kind of an underlying point, I guess. What am I trying to say here? I mean, more just in terms of by adding an extra syllable, you're kind of then drawing someone's attention to that line in particular. It's showing that something's going on there. So in this case, it's sort of that's the clincher at the end of each verse, you have that extra syllable to kind of add that sense of finality going on.
And what you said actually there is kind of to draw your attention to something happening, right? At the end of the stanza. And literally in the first stanza, for example, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. It's very descriptive.
Yes.
There's movement going on, fluttering and dancing and breeze. There is a lot of motion in the words. And so, to use that extra syllable to maybe draw people's attention to that, for sure. Yeah, totally. Great. I think it would be interesting if we were to try and make our own little piece of poetry, kind of derived from this, and maybe some of the images in there. And I think you have some experience making your own poetry.
Yes,
I guess speak to that
for sure. I mean, yes, I guess. I think an interesting thing about poetry is that, of course, when I was younger, I don't know. When you're exposed to poetry when you're younger, or when you have poetry talked at you as a small child in school,
right.
It can be very, I guess, uninviting or very, it can seem inaccessible. And often when I was growing up, I always thought, poets, those are very kind of contemplative, artistic people that are poets. There's an archetypal type of person you need to be a poet.
Right.
And I'm certainly not some old learned person, in a study somewhere contemplating higher truths and writing lines about it. So yeah, I didn't think much about poetry. However, as I read more poetry, I think then with it kind of like created the desire to then write it myself.
To just try it.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
So it wasn't until I was like maybe 19 or so that I started to play around writing a bit. And so yeah, I've written some poetry, but not really in any formal rhyming scheme or poetic form per se. I guess I belong more to the what would be called the free verse school, which is a fairly contemporary type of poetry. In some ways, I mean, it's funny. So, man, like, I don't know, some of my favorite poems are in free verse, but I know like some of like the great poets had quite a negative, derisive opinion about free verse. So Robert Frost, right, widely considered one of the greatest like contemporary poets of all time, you know, like The Road Less Traveled and everything that he did. I love the way he described free verse. He said, he hated it. He's like, it is sloppy. It's an excuse for like poet wannabes to like get away with saying they're poets, but like all the pros don't do it that way. He was very much gatekeeping. He was kind of gatekeeping it, you know. And he said, I love the metaphor because it's very visceral. He said writing in free verse is like playing tennis with the net down.
Interesting.
Yeah. As in, it's like the challenge is that you need to clear the net, right? You know, and I in some ways, he's kind of right. Where I mean, it's like there's a delicate balance, I think, with anything in art. Where I mean, like free verse can get away on you. It can get, you know, kind of rambly, but at the same time, I think if you're freed away from the conventions of like a strict rhyming structure, it allows you to kind of utilize and play with language in a different way, different than what you would get in something, say like an A-B-C-C rhyme scheme. However, I mean, it still is poetry, and critically, you're still playing with, well, you know, like you're playing with line, you're playing with meter. One of my favorite things to do as a free verse poet is to really play with line length. So actually, you know how you were mentioning, so there's 9 syllables closing out, you know, like the final part of each of these stanzas here. So in free verse, you can almost like just run with that, where if you kind of really want to stress that there's like a certain concept or feeling going on in the poem, I understand it. It's called the breath of the line. Like you can then really draw that line out to kind of express either maybe like exasperation or a critical moment, maybe like a feeling of deep despair, maybe like a feeling of rumination. And it's physically inhered in the poem because like the line just keeps going on. And then now you're physically, as a poet, as you're saying it, you are still actively having to drag the line on. And in that way, it's like the structure of the poem is in some ways reflecting the content it's describing, I guess.
No, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, no. And yeah, like very interesting ideas in there around, you know, potentially some of the greats hating free verse, and, but it making it more accessible, I think, is a big thing.
No, totally, yes.
And I think that's kind of maybe a theme that we've been exploring, right, with that automated art style. To try and make it more accessible. You just pick up a pencil. It doesn't have to be, or there are many different types of HB pencils, but you just pick one of them up and you just draw some lines, and then you'll figure out the rules as you go. And like, I think that maybe that's kind of the game that you can play with free verse, is you can maybe build some rules in there. But I think, but then obviously to combat it, you know, maybe rambling or not quite getting across what you're trying to say, you can impose some rules to begin with. So I think like for ourselves, when we go to create ours, I think maybe if we try to go for like 12 lines. So if these are 6 each and there's 4 of them, so maybe we'll kind of halve it basically. And
for sure, because whereas I Wandered Lonely is 24 in total, like we're gonna play with 12.
We'll give ourselves the limit of 12, but maybe we'll run with the free verse.
But the verse is free. I like that.
Let's do that.
Sick. Yeah.
Awesome, cool. I don't know. I'm just gonna actually set up my paper here, and I'm
I like that.
Write 1 through 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Oh gosh.
Yeah.
11. 12. Okay.
And I think, so maybe one more thought I had just about the nature of, like free verse, and I think it might help us jump into the poem, is also why I really like free verse. So yeah, I guess, obviously, like, I'm not a very experienced poet at all.
Meaning?
But exactly, yeah. But I think free verse, what you said really, I think spoke to the core of it, where as kind of an amateur who like sort of fell in love with poetry as like a young man, but then like was totally intimidated and somewhat maybe a bit put off by the way it was presented throughout, like my schooling. Free verse was like kind of the perfectly accessible inroad because whereas I thought, to be a poet, like a capital P poet, you had to know all of like the line schemes, you had to know all the poetic conventions, you had to have your syllables locked in. And I mean, that's scary and kind of dense and esoteric. But whereas free verse, I think what's beautiful about it is that it kind of just gets to the core of, I mean, like we have experiences or concepts, or we'll think or see something that is so deeply impactful, we want to describe it somehow and capture it in a poem. And so I think whereas, maybe a strict rhyming scheme, you begin with the format itself and then, like fit your concept into it. For free verse, it's like it kind of it starts with like the primacy of human experience. And then like the language itself, you just kind of draw upon to like solidify whatever it is. But it's just like that initial feeling or desire to write in the first place that you start with, and not like the learned knowledge of like, this is the scheme and I will now compose like poetry,
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you for sharing that. So I'm not gonna lie, I don't think I have any experience with free verse. I played with a bit of poetry and I like rhyming, and so I'm excited to potentially maybe not be rhyming and just see where the thoughts and ideas come from. But so I think should we try and draw on some images or feelings from the original, and then put it and come up with our own kind of concept, and then see if we can put that into some words? Or
for sure. No, I like that. Okay. So yeah, I guess, and maybe I'll throw it to you then to start off with. Sure. From the poem, like, is there a certain line or imagery or like a phrase that kind of stuck out to you?
I think I'm gonna read the first stanza one more time, and just see what stands out.
Okay.
So, I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Interesting. So, I mean, just like generally, without kind of diving into it too much, I think there's this idea of kind of drudging along, going through your everyday life, and then like, and then just kind of this sudden shock to the system of seeing this sight that you've never seen before. It reminds me of like walking down the street and you see the same things every day, or drive past the same things every day. But then suddenly something's different. Something's changed in your environment, and it catches your eye, your imagination. It kind of makes your heart beat twice, And so that's what I kind of glean from the first stanza right away. So, what would we do from there in your opinion?
Now, first of all, man, like that is a beautiful read of like the first section there, and I think that you kind of just like that really is at the core of it, and I love the way you put it, where, like you said, there's kind of like this regular routine, potential monotony, just a regular day-to-day life, but you come across certain moments or instances that, like you said, like you take note, and it kind of maybe like centers you again, and I think there's something to play with in there, totally.
And I think that like another thing in there, diving a little bit more into like the word choices for me, like wandered lonely as a cloud. I think there's this idea of maybe like that aspect of connecting, and so maybe connecting with nature, I guess, too, is a big thing. And I think that that's actually quite important, like nowadays, because that idea of connecting back with nature and
Yes.
getting off our cell phones maybe.
Yeah.
Or our
Yeah.
TVs
No, for sure.
And just like, reconnecting with the people around us or like the environment. And
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh man. No, there's so much to
Moving,
do
so,
there.
Yeah. So we don't have to
no
fit all of that into like one line.
No,
I
no.
guess,
But so I think for like a good inroad to our free verse poem, and this is when you were saying walking down the sidewalk and you see a jolt to your system,
Yeah.
and also just with the imagery and the themes at play in this poem. What occurred to me right now is often, when you're walking around town, like there's sidewalks. As they get older, cracks appear in them. And I always just love seeing when like plants against all odds like breach through the asphalt or the pavement, or there's one tiny little meager crack and somehow there's like a pretty healthy looking like dandelion, coming up through it.
Yeah.
And honestly, so for free verse then, this would be I think a lot of poems can start out almost conversationally, where that's sort of just like an initial image or observation, and then that's sort of like the initial topic, and then we can kind of just use that as an inroad and then go in from there.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm actually having an idea right
Okay.
now.
Yeah.
So what if we decide on that image? So right now I'm hearing that image of like, something, nature finding its way through the concrete, basically.
Yeah.
And that being a shock to the system. What if we both take a second to write our own first lines,
okay. Damn.
and then we'll
Okay.
just see how different they are.
Okay. Yeah.
And then if we have time, maybe we could like meld them together into like a third poem that is like an amalgamation of both.
Oh, as in, so we're gonna each do our own poem then,
but
possibly?
we'll decide each line or whatever.
Or like the core concept or the
for each bit. We'll kind of decide on that image, and then we'll both just give it a go.
Oh man, I'm into
happens.
it. Okay.
Okay.
Totally. Nice.
Okay. So for line one, do we want it to be just line one, or like 1 and 2, or free verse? I don't know how.
Yeah. So I think with free verse, let's just try doing that for the first line. So in whichever way you want to describe what we talked about, yeah,
let's do that.
Just let's
and
try
it can
that.
Be any number of syllables.
Any number of syllables. You don't need to set up a rhyme. If you want to set up a rhyme, you can. But no, like the net's down. Like whatever's good, right?
Okay,
so
net is down.
the net is down. So
that honestly makes me think of ping pong. You know how frustrating ping pong is?
Like it clips a millimeter below the net. Yeah.
I love it. Okay. So yeah, we'll take a second, and we're going with that idea of walking down the street. It's monotony, but then you see some nature breaking through the concrete and finding a way through, and that is like a shock to the system. That's kind of what we're going for.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see how it goes.
Let's try this.
Okay. It's gonna be a little quiet here while we do this. But yeah, I guess when you're writing, I know we're both trying to focus here, but
no worries.
If you have capacity, like, do you normally write in silence, or would you have music playing or a TV show?
I often find I do have to write in silence. But I mean, I think often, even sometimes like an idea for a poem or a line or just an image will occur to me, like say if I'm driving or like eating lunch. So I'll kind of like have the thought and then I'll write it down silently, but then immediately I feel that like I need to start speaking it out to see if like the words feel right, in my mouth, and
so you
move
would
on
actually
from
kind of
there.
speak through it.
Yeah, as in it's like, like write it out first, but like at least I find that like lines need to be talked through in order to kind of like get a feel for it.
And I think that's really interesting, because when I think back to like Shakespeare and like even this during the time that it might have been released, I think that idea of like levels of society, what's that called? When only certain people would be literate, right?
Oh, I see. Yeah.
And that kind of layer of, and so like, I often wonder if these were actually written to be spoken and heard as opposed to read. But nowadays, hopefully the majority of folks can read it for themselves. But I think that's just really interesting what you're saying about, you can write it and you can write all day long, but when you actually go to say it, there's something in that, right? That kind of affects it
No, and I think that's part of, I think, why I enjoy memorizing and then reciting poetry, where especially like being able to recite like a really good poem from a really good poet, like it's just inherently fun to say. Like the language is good, like they hit certain strides or phrases or like alliterary streaks, and like it's just fun to speak aloud, I guess.
Totally.
Yeah. Okay.
We'll take another second here to just finish our first line and see how this goes.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's Clark and Perry on the case. Da-na-na-na. Clark and Perry do what it takes. Da-na-na-na. Clark and Perry investigate.
The activities and interests of local artists in the Windy City's finest throughout both Lethbridge and Medicine Hat, Alberta. Available on TELUS Optic TV, On Demand, VidFlex, YouTube, and more for limited time only. Terms and conditions apply.
Da-na-na-na.